It was the summer of 1968 when the Pacific was alive with ships, submarines, and silent tension. The Cold War had stretched its shadow over every ocean, and young sailors like Robert Hale found themselves at the edge of history, patrolling waters where politics, paranoia, and the unknown all collided. Robert was serving aboard the USS Cyclone, a mid-sized naval patrol vessel operating off the California coast. On paper, it was a routine mission, coastal monitoring, radio checks, nothing remarkable. But what happened on that gray June morning would become one of the Navy's most baffling unsolved cases. The ship left port in San Diego under clear skies. The crew was in good spirits, the kind of tight-knit camaraderie only weeks at sea can forge. Robert had written a letter to his wife the night before, a simple note about looking forward to shore leave, about a new car they might buy, about the baby they hoped to have one day. That letter never made it to her hands. At 10:15 a.m., during a standard equipment check, Robert was reported missing. No splash was heard, no alarms raised. One moment he was with his crew, the next he was gone. The officer on duty swore he had just spoken to him minutes earlier near the stern, but when another sailor went to fetch him, only empty deck and the endless horizon remained. The ship immediately went into emergency procedures. The waters were scanned, life rings thrown, helicopters scrambled from shore. For 72 hours, the Navy combed a 20-mile stretch of ocean. They found no trace, no uniform, no boots, no body. The official report listed the cause as lost at sea, an accident, perhaps a slip in heavy weather. But the crew wasn't convinced. The morning had been calm, the waters glassy. Robert was an experienced sailor, steady on his feet, not the type to stumble over a railing. And then there was the logbook entry, a cryptic line written the night before in Robert's own hand. "If anything happens tomorrow, tell her I knew." It was underlined twice. 50 years later, divers would return to those same waters and discover something that would force everyone to reconsider what really happened that day. But in 1968, all that remained was silence, an empty space where a young sailor once stood and a family left with questions that would outlive generations. Robert Hale was 24 years old when the sea swallowed him whole. Born in 1944 in a small coastal town in Oregon, he had grown up with salt air in his lungs and the sound of gulls as his morning alarm. His father had been a fisherman, his mother a schoolteacher, and together they raised a boy who was as comfortable with books as he was with nets. Robert was known for his sharp mind and easy laugh, the kind of man who could fix an engine with one hand and write a love poem with the other. After high school, he enlisted, drawn by duty, adventure, and a steady paycheck that would allow him to marry his childhood sweetheart, Margaret. They wed in the spring of 1967, a modest ceremony in a church that smelled faintly of sea lilies and candle wax. Friends remembered the way he looked at her that day, like a man who had found safe harbor in a storm. He spoke often of building a future together, a small house, children, maybe even opening a little shop when his Navy days were done. But beneath the optimism, Robert carried burdens no one fully understood. Letters to Margaret were filled with love, but also with hints of unease. He wrote about sleepless nights aboard the Cyclone, about strange noises echoing in the hull when the waters were calm, about the feeling of being watched even when alone. Shipmates described him as reliable, but sometimes distant, prone to staring out at the horizon as though listening to something no one else could hear. Some laughed it off as the nerves of a young sailor. Others weren't so sure. Robert had recently been promoted, and the pressure of responsibility weighed on him. Yet he still found joy in the small things, sketching in the margins of his journal, humming to himself while polishing brass, carrying a pocket compass his father had given him before he shipped out. That compass would later be found in his locker, the needle frozen, unmoving. To Margaret, he was everything. To the Navy, he was another promising young man serving his country. To the ocean, He was just another name to claim. His disappearance would break her heart, shatter his family, and ignite whispers among sailors that never died. Robert Hale wasn't just a sailor lost at sea. He was a man full of dreams, suddenly erased by a silence too deep to comprehend. June 12, 1968 began like any other day at sea. The USS Cyclone glided steadily through the Pacific waters, its gray hull cutting across the horizon with quiet authority. The mission was routine: patrol the coastal approaches, test new sonar equipment, and maintain a presence in contested waters during a time when every radar blip was viewed with suspicion. To the crew, it was just another day marked by drills, laughter in the mess hall, and the low thrum of engines. To Robert Hale, it was supposed to be uneventful, a chance to write home, maybe catch a few moments of calm before the ship returned to port. But as the hours passed, calm seas began to shift. At first it was subtle, a sudden haze rolling in from the west, the kind of fog that clings too tightly to the water. Then, the sonar began picking up faint irregularities. Blips appeared and vanished, echoes with no source. The operator chalked it up to interference, but more than one sailor later admitted the atmosphere felt wrong, charged as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. Robert had been on deck that morning talking with two crewmen about their plans for shore leave. He was light-hearted, teasing one about losing at cards, smiling in a way that betrayed no sign of trouble. Yet, according to another shipmate, when the fog thickened, Robert grew quiet. He moved toward the stern, staring into the haze like he expected something to emerge. Conflicting reports surfaced later. Some said he looked ill, pale, unsettled. Others swore he seemed entranced, almost calm, as if waiting. One sailor remembered Robert muttering, "It's close now," though no one could say what he meant. Official logs don't capture these fragments. They remain whispers passed between men who were there that day. The logbook simply states, "Weather shift at 09:45 hours, visibility poor." But those who remembered it described a change not just in the sea, but in the mood of the entire ship. Radios crackled with static, compasses wavered slightly off true north, and even the gulls that often followed vanished into the mist. Something had changed. By 10 a.m. the fog was so thick the horizon was gone. Within 15 minutes Robert Hale would vanish with it, leaving behind nothing but contradictions. At 10:12 a.m. the Cyclone's bridge reported business as usual. The engines hummed steady, radar sweeps showed no nearby vessels, and the ship maintained course. But below deck, men later recalled a sudden tension, the kind of silence that amplifies every sound, from the drip of condensation to the shuffle of boots on steel. 3 minutes later, Robert Hale was gone. Witnesses disagreed on the moment. One sailor claimed he saw Robert leaning against the rail, hands on the cold metal, staring out at the fog. Another swore he'd just passed him, heading toward the aft hatch. But by the time the next man went looking, Robert was nowhere. A frantic search erupted across the ship. Hatches were checked, compartments cleared, even the engine room combed through. Nothing. Within minutes, the alarm sounded, and the Cyclone's radio officer sent out the first terse transmission. "Possible man overboard, initiating recovery procedure." The voice was calm, professional, but beneath it was the crackle of panic. Ships in the vicinity responded. Helicopters scrambled from shore, their blades chopping the mist into restless waves. For hours, lifeboats combed the water in widening circles, but the Pacific gave nothing back. No ripple, no cry for help, no trace of a man who only moments before had been alive and well. At 1400 hours, the Cyclone sent another radio message, this one heavier. No contact. Continuing search. By nightfall, silence returned. The logbook would later record Robert Hale as lost overboard, presumed drowned, the words stamped with bureaucratic finality. But those who were there never accepted it. The seas had been calm, the rails high, and Robert a trained sailor. There was no splash, no fall, no struggle. It was as though he had simply ceased to exist. In the official archives, the day ends with ink and paperwork. But in the memory of his shipmates, it ends with unanswered questions and a hollow feeling that something unnatural had unfolded on their watch. Robert Hale was gone, swallowed not by a wave, but by a silence so complete that half a century later, it still echoes. In the days before Robert's disappearance, the USS Cyclone carried an unease that no one could quite name. Officially, the logs show smooth sailing, drills completed, and no disciplinary issues reported. Unofficially, the crew whispered. Sailors who shared Robert's quarters recalled how he had begun pacing at night, restless in a way that made sleep nearly impossible for those around him. He'd rise from his bunk, step quietly across the metal floor, and stand by the porthole for hours, staring into the black water. He looked like he was waiting for something, one crewmate later said. Not scared exactly, just expectant. Others remembered arguments, quiet but tense. One in particular was overheard in the mess hall, Robert clashing with Petty Officer Dunn, a grizzled veteran who'd spent half his life at sea. Dunn accused Robert of seeing things that weren't there, of scaring the younger sailors with talk of shadows moving alongside the ship. Robert had snapped back, saying he wasn't imagining it, that the sea keeps count, and it knows when it's owed. The words chilled the men at the table, though none would repeat them until years later, when the legend of his vanishing grew. What unsettled the crew most wasn't Robert's words, but his demeanor. Normally quick to joke or offer a hand, he had withdrawn, his eyes always darting to the horizon, his smile replaced by a kind of distant weight. A shipmate claimed he caught Robert scribbling furiously in a notebook one night, whispering under his breath as though transcribing something he'd heard. When asked what he was writing, Robert had snapped the book shut and muttered, "Just keeping track." Few pressed further. Sailors learn quickly to respect another man's demons, even if they don't understand them. By the morning of June 12th, the whispers had become louder than the engines. Some said Robert was cracking under pressure, others swore he knew something none of them did. But when he vanished without a trace, those whispers grew into something else, a legend that would cling to the Cyclone long after its patrol ended. When the search for Robert Hale was called off, investigators turned to what remained of his belongings. His locker was ordinary enough. A neatly folded uniform, a shaving kit, a compass gifted by his father. But tucked beneath a rolled-up blanket was a small black journal, water-stained at the edges, its pages filled with tight, hurried handwriting. The first entries were harmless, almost mundane. Notes about drills, sketches of the coastline, small love letters drafted to his wife Margaret that he never mailed. But as the weeks went on, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew jagged, pressed hard into the paper as though each word had been forced out. "The voices come after midnight," one line read. "They rise with the tide. No one else hears them but me." Another entry described footsteps on the deck when he was alone, the sound of boots pacing just beyond his cabin door. He wrote of dreams that felt too vivid, of being pulled under the waves only to wake, gasping for breath. The most chilling passage came just 3 days before his disappearance. "They follow the ship. I see them when the moon is low, shapes just beneath the surface. They wait and they count. I think they are waiting for me." Navy investigators dismissed the journal as the product of stress or fatigue. A psychiatrist attached to the case suggested Robert had been experiencing hallucinations brought on by exhaustion, but those who had sailed with him weren't so quick to agree. The entries matched the unease they had all felt, but could never put into words. It wasn't just Robert who seemed on edge. The entire crew had noticed the silence of birds, the strange behavior of their instruments, the fog that appeared without warning. The journal became more than just evidence. It became a relic, a piece of Robert's mind preserved on paper, hinting at something the Navy couldn't explain and didn't want to. Decades later, when divers rediscovered the wreckage tied to Robert's fate, fragments of those same words would resurface, echoing like warnings carried on the tide. But in 1968, the journal was simply filed away, labeled as personal effects, and quietly forgotten. Another piece of a puzzle no one dared to solve. The Navy wasted no time once Robert Hale was reported missing. Within minutes, the USS Cyclone had slowed to a crawl, life rings cutting across the misty water, the crew straining their eyes for any movement in the endless gray. Radio calls brought helicopters screaming overhead, their rotors scattering the fog as searchlights danced across the waves. By nightfall, divers had been deployed, their bodies swallowed by the cold, murky depths in hopes of finding even a trace of the young sailor. For 3 days, the Pacific was carved open by engines and propellers. Boats traced grid patterns across 20 miles of ocean, sonar scans swept the seafloor, and divers plunged again and again, surfacing only to shake their heads. Nothing. No bubbles of air, no shred of fabric, not even the glint of a dog tag beneath the waves. The official report later noted strong currents in the area, suggesting Robert's body could have been carried away before recovery. But the divers who searched weren't convinced. They described unusually still water, conditions almost too calm for such a disappearance. One veteran diver admitted years later, "It felt like the sea didn't want to give anything back, like it had swallowed him whole." The search ended the same way it had begun, with silence. The Cyclone returned to port, its crew thinner in spirit than in number. For all their training, for all their procedure, they were powerless against the vastness of the ocean. The case was filed away as another tragic accident, another sailor lost at sea. But to those who had looked into Robert's eyes in the final days, who had heard his cryptic words and seen his restless pacing, the official story didn't sit right. Men whispered that the sea had taken him. Yes, but not by chance. Something unseen had claimed him, and it had left nothing behind. When word of Robert's disappearance reached shore, it hit like a hammer. Margaret Hale was only 22, barely a year into her marriage, when the knock came on her door. 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, caps in hand, their expressions rehearsed but heavy. They told her Robert had been lost overboard during routine operations, presumed drowned, no remains recovered. She collapsed before they finished the sentence. In the weeks that followed, Margaret lived in a haze of condolences, casseroles, and folded flags. The Navy provided honors, a small pension, and a ceremony at sea where a wreath was cast upon the waves. But none of it filled the silence in her home. Their wedding photo still hung on the wall, Robert's side of the bed remained untouched, and his last letter, written but never mailed, stayed locked in her hands until the ink smudged from tears. Robert's mother, Evelyn Hale, refused to accept the official story. At the memorial she stood tall, her voice trembling as she told the gathered crowd, "He didn't just fall. Something took him." She repeated it again and again, until it became a mantra the family carried into the years ahead. To Evelyn, the Navy's explanation was a convenient lie, a way to close a file without facing what truly happened. She pointed to Robert's journal, to the strange words he'd written in the weeks before he vanished. To her, they weren't the scribblings of a man unraveling, but warnings. Margaret, torn between grief and loyalty, kept the journal tucked away, too painful to read yet impossible to destroy. The family's grief fractured under the weight of the unknown. Some accepted the loss as fate. Others clung to Evelyn's conviction that Robert's disappearance was no accident. In the absence of truth, the Hale family lived in 2 worlds, one where Robert had drowned and one where he had been taken by something they could never name. And as the years turned into decades, the wound refused to close. Every holiday, every birthday, every quiet evening, when Margaret lit a candle by the window, the same thought returned like a tide. Robert wasn't finished with them. The ocean still held him, and someday, somehow, it would give him back. By late June 1968, the Navy had finished its paperwork. After 3 days of fruitless searching, after helicopters had swept the waves and divers had scoured the depths, the case of Seaman Robert Hale was officially closed. The language was cold, bureaucratic, written more for efficiency than truth. Lost at sea, presumed drowned during routine operations, no remains recovered. It was stamped, signed, and filed away. For the Navy, the story ended there. Robert's personal effects were boxed up and sent to his family. A folded flag was presented with solemn precision. His name was etched onto a memorial wall at the base in San Diego, alongside dozens of other sailors who had never come home. To the public, Robert became just another casualty of the ocean, another name lost to the statistics of naval life. For Margaret, the ceremony felt like a theft, a life reduced to marble and silence. She stood among widows clutching photographs, listening to an officer speak about sacrifice and honor. But the words slid past her. All she could think of was Robert's voice, the way he had promised to come home, the way he had laughed about buying that second-hand car they had seen on Market Street. To her, he wasn't a casualty. He was unfinished, stolen from her without explanation. The Navy moved on quickly. Ships needed to sail, patrols needed to continue, and new recruits took the bunks once filled by the missing. The official story hardened into fact. Hale slipped, fell, drowned. An accident. But in the quiet corners of the ship, among men who had seen the fog that morning, among those who had heard Robert's strange words and read the journal entries no one could explain, the story refused to settle. It clung like salt to skin, an irritation that never healed. Official closure may have ended the file, but it did not end the doubt. Long after the Cyclone had returned to port, the whispers persisted. In bars near the naval yard, over beers passed between weary hands, sailors told the story of Robert Hale, and it was never the same twice. Some swore he had gone mad in the days before, pacing the deck and speaking of shadows in the water. Others claimed he had been calm, eerily calm, as though he knew his fate. One rumor said he had been spotted the very moment before he vanished, not falling, but leaning forward over the rail as if answering some silent call from the sea. Another rumor, darker still, claimed a sailor had heard a splash, but also something else. A voice carried on the fog, whispering Robert's name. None of this made it into the official record, but it passed like current through the fleet. Younger sailors heard it as a ghost story, told in bunks when the lights went out. Veterans, though, treated it with quiet seriousness. They said the sea has rules, old rules, and sometimes it collects debts no one understands. To them, Robert wasn't lost to clumsiness or chance. He had been taken. The whispers grew louder with each retelling. Some said his journal had been confiscated by higher-ups because it mentioned things the Navy didn't want to admit. Others said the compass found in his locker, its needle frozen, was evidence of something unnatural. None of it could be proven, but none of it could be dismissed either. Officially, Robert Hale was gone, drowned in a routine accident. But among the men who had sailed with him, among the families who read his last strange words, the truth was something else, something heavier. The Navy might have written his ending, but the ocean had written another, and every sailor who passed through those waters carried the same uneasy thought. What if the sea wasn't done with them either? The Navy may have closed Robert Hale's file, but sailors never did. On ships passing through that same stretch of water, a story began to grow, one that didn't live in official reports but in whispers exchanged below deck, when the night was long and the sea stretched black and endless. They called it the phantom current, a silent pull beneath the surface that dragged at ships and rattled compasses. Some claimed they had felt it themselves, a subtle shift in the hull, as though something vast moved just beneath them. Others spoke of hearing faint tapping on the underside of their vessels when the fog closed in like fingers brushing steel. Robert's name became part of the legend. Hale's current, some recruits muttered, a warning shared with wide-eyed new sailors. They said his spirit lingered, pulled into the deep but never resting, waiting to claim others. One story told of a sailor who swore he saw a figure in dress whites standing on the water during a night watch. The face pale, the eyes hollow, the resemblance to Robert undeniable. Another spoke of a diver who refused to go back down after hearing a voice call his name through the static of his radio, though no one else heard a thing. The Navy discouraged these tales, calling them dangerous superstition, but legends grow stronger in silence. The more the brass tried to stamp them out, the more the whispers thrived, and always Robert was at the center. To some he was a victim of bad luck, turned into folklore by frightened minds. To others he was a warning, proof that the sea takes what it wants, and when it does, it leaves behind only stories. Even decades later, new recruits would board ships and hear the same caution. Don't lean too close to the rail in the fog, or Robert Hale will take your place. For Margaret Hale, legends meant nothing. What she carried was absence, a silence that filled her small home like a tide. She refused to move away from the coast, even when relatives urged her to start over somewhere far from the water. Instead, she chose to live by the sea, close to the place where Robert had vanished, as though proximity itself might tether him to her memory. Every June 12th, the anniversary of his disappearance, she lit a lantern and placed it on the shoreline. Neighbors sometimes saw her standing there long after midnight, the lantern flickering against the waves, her eyes searching the horizon as though expecting a figure to emerge. She never remarried, despite her youth. Suitors came and went, kind men who offered comfort and stability, but she always declined. Her heart remained with Robert, and no one else could fill that space. In time, the lantern became its own legend. Fishermen claimed they could see it glowing miles out at sea, a small beacon on a dark coast. Some swore it was joined by another light, faint and distant, moving across the water in answer. Margaret never spoke of visions, never told anyone if she felt his presence near. But those who knew her best said she believed. She kept his journal locked away, the pages she could barely read without shaking. She touched the frozen compass needle as if it might stir. And every year she whispered the same words into the salt air, "Come home." The Navy had closed his story. Sailors had turned him into myth. But for Margaret Hale, the vigil was real, a thread of hope burning against the endless dark, year after year after year. For decades after Robert Hale's disappearance, the Pacific remained silent. Storms came and went, tides pulled and receded, but no evidence ever surfaced. The Navy's search had ended in futility, and nature soon erased even the faintest traces of that June morning. Charts marked the location, logbooks noted the date, but the sea itself gave nothing back. Sailors passed through the waters and felt only the weight of what was missing, a life swallowed, a story unfinished. Families of the lost often cling to relics, to the hope that the ocean might someday return what it took. But in Robert's case, the sea kept its secrets with a cruelty that hardened into permanence. Not a scrap of fabric, not a bone, not even a floating boot drifted to shore. Margaret waited, lantern in hand, but the tides betrayed her faith year after year. Evelyn, Robert's mother, insisted the ocean had claimed him for a reason, her conviction unshaken, even as the world moved on. Meanwhile, sailors' stories of phantom currents and whispers in the fog grew louder, but no proof followed. The ocean, vast and indifferent, erased with one hand and concealed with the other. It is said that the sea remembers everything, every wreck, every secret, every scream swallowed by waves, yet it gives nothing freely. Decades passed, and Robert's name remained etched in stone while the water above his grave rolled endlessly on, carrying new ships and new generations who heard his legend but never saw his face. To the world, his fate was sealed. To the ocean, it was only the beginning. On June 12, 1993, the 25th anniversary of Robert Hale's vanishing, the sea reminded everyone that it never forgets. That morning began calm, skies unusually clear, the kind of serene summer day that draws fishermen far offshore. Dozens of boats worked the waters where the cyclone had once patrolled, radios buzzing with chatter, nets heavy with the season's catch. But by late afternoon, the horizon darkened. Clouds gathered with unnatural speed, and the wind shifted suddenly, snapping sails and whipping waves into jagged peaks. Within an hour, a violent storm engulfed the area. Lightning clawed across the sky, thunder rolled like artillery fire, and the ocean heaved as though some buried giant was stirring. Most of the boats made for shore, engines straining against the surge, but not before several crews reported seeing something that chilled them more than the storm itself. Amid the sheets of rain, illuminated by flashes of lightning, they swore they saw a lone figure standing on the waves. Not swimming, not flailing, but standing, motionless, upright, as if the sea itself was holding him aloft. Dressed in what looked like faded whites, the figure appeared for seconds at a time before vanishing back into the surge. Some thought it was a trick of the lightning, a phantom born of fear. Others, seasoned men who knew the difference between illusion and reality, refused to dismiss it so easily. They whispered a name they had heard since their first days at sea, Hale. When the storm finally passed, the water calmed, as if nothing had happened. But those who witnessed the figure carried the image with them to shore, telling their stories in hushed tones. For the families who still mourned, it was proof that Robert was not gone, not entirely. For the Navy, it was superstition, dismissed as nonsense. But for the fishermen who swore they saw him on that violent anniversary night, it was something else entirely. A reminder that the ocean doesn't just keep secrets. Sometimes it shows you just enough to keep you looking. By the mid-1990s, Robert Hale's disappearance was little more than a footnote buried deep in Cold War records. The world had moved on, the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and dusty file cabinets in forgotten naval archives were slowly being sorted and declassified. It was during this wave of bureaucratic cleanup that a naval historian named Dr. Alan Kendrick stumbled across Hale's case. Kendrick was researching routine patrol patterns of the late 1960s, tracing deployments that never made headlines but quietly shaped the balance of power. He expected patrol logs, fuel reports, and maintenance records. What he found instead was an odd cluster of documents. A personnel file marked with Hale's name, a missing person report stamped classified, and a search log riddled with redactions. Kendrick was struck immediately by the inconsistencies. The official accident report claimed seas were rough, visibility poor, and conditions unsafe. But weather data for that day showed calm waters and clear skies until the sudden fog rolled in. The crew statements had been summarized rather than transcribed, boiled down into sterile language that contradicted the fragments of testimony he later unearthed in separate memos. Some sailors had mentioned strange sounds, others unusual readings on instruments. None of that appeared in the final report. Most curious of all, the timeline was fractured. Hale was reported missing at 10:15 a.m., yet the first rescue call wasn't logged until nearly half an hour later. What happened in that missing window of time? Why had the Navy redacted what should have been a routine man overboard case? The deeper Kendrick dug, the stranger it became. He began to suspect that Hale's disappearance was more than an accident the Navy wanted forgotten. It was a story the Navy had deliberately buried. And then, tucked among navigational charts of the Pacific, he found something even stranger, a hand-drawn map, folded and brittle with age, with a single mark that offered more questions than answers. The chart was unlike anything Kendrick expected to find. It was dated June 1968, the same month Robert Hale vanished, and clearly belonged to the Cyclone's patrol records. At first glance it looked ordinary. Longitude and latitude lines, marked patrol routes, notes scribbled in shorthand. But in the center of the page, near the coordinates where Hale was last seen, there was an X-no annotation, no explanation, just a dark, deliberate mark. Beside it, faintly penciled in block letters, were the words, "Hold position." Kendrick cross-referenced the chart with official logs. The ship had never reported holding position there. The patrol route was supposed to have continued south without interruption. So why did this chart suggest otherwise? And who had drawn the X? He showed it to colleagues who suggested it might have been a navigation note, perhaps a temporary stop for repairs. But Kendrick wasn't convinced. The X was drawn too boldly, too intentionally, and the absence of any explanation gnawed at him. He combed through the file again and discovered that the map was filed separately from the rest of the Cyclone's navigational records, almost as if someone had slipped it in later or pulled it out to be hidden. The handwriting didn't match the captain's log, nor the first officer's notes. Yet it was familiar. After weeks of comparison, Kendrick realized it bore striking similarities to Robert Hale's own handwriting in the journal that had been recovered from his locker. If Hale had drawn it, then the implications were chilling. He had marked something, some point in the ocean, before he vanished. And if it wasn't Hale's hand, then someone else aboard the Cyclone had known more than they ever admitted. Kendrick filed the chart back into the folder, his hands shaking slightly. To him, it wasn't just a strange map, it was a breadcrumb, one that suggested Hale's disappearance was no accident of chance or sea, but the result of something deliberate, something hidden in plain sight, waiting for those willing to look. Half a century after Robert Hale's disappearance, the Pacific had long since rolled over the mystery, as if time itself had conspired with the ocean to bury the truth. But in 2018, a private team of wreck divers returned to those same waters, not looking for Hale, but mapping the seabed as part of a survey project. Advances in sonar and deep-diving equipment had turned once impossible searches into routine expeditions. What was inaccessible to the Navy in 1968 could now be scanned in hours. The team was led by Marcus Kellen, a veteran diver who had spent 2 decades hunting down forgotten wrecks. His crew was accustomed to pulling history out of the dark: downed planes, lost cargo ships, sunken fishing boats. Most expeditions ended in routine charting and cataloging. But Marcus had heard whispers, stories from old sailors about a phantom current, about a man who vanished without a trace. He wasn't chasing a ghost story, but curiosity has a way of steering even the most seasoned divers. In early May, their boat dropped anchor near the coordinates marked by Kendrick's rediscovered map. The sea was calm, the skies clear, and the sonar equipment was readied. The divers joked at first, teasing one another about looking for Hale. But beneath the surface of their humor was something else: anticipation. For years the site had been marked only by silence. Now, with technology Hale's shipmates could never have imagined, they were about to peel back the layers of silt and time. At first the sonar showed what they expected: ridges of rock, uneven sandbars, the subtle contours of a seafloor unchanged for centuries. Then a faint shadow appeared. Marcus leaned forward over the monitor, frowning. The shape was too angular, too deliberate to be natural. The laughter on deck faded as the blip returned again and again, more defined with every pass. Something metallic was buried beneath the sand. At 230 feet below the surface, the water was cold, black, and heavy with pressure. The divers descended cautiously, beams of light cutting thin paths through the silt. The sonar had promised them something unusual, but nothing prepared them for the outline that began to emerge as they swept their lights across the seabed. It wasn't a natural formation, it was a structure, steel, corroded but intact, edges half buried in layers of sediment. The divers circled slowly, their breath rasping loud in their helmets, hearts pounding as the ghostly silhouette sharpened into form. It looked like part of a vessel, though not large enough to be an entire ship. Plates of rusted metal jutted from the sand like broken ribs, and cables trailed off into the darkness. Then came the discovery that stopped them cold, a rectangular shape wedged against the debris, too clean and symmetrical to be random. They brushed away the silt with gloved hands, revealing a corroded but recognizable surface, a locker. Its handle was sealed shut by decades of salt and pressure, its frame bent but not broken. And stamped faintly on the metal, just barely legible through the rust, were initials scratched in by hand, R.H. Marcus steadied his light, his voice breaking through the comms with a whisper no one dared mock. Hale. The ocean had held its secret for 50 years, but now it had been found. Whatever lay inside that locker would either confirm the legend or plunge it deeper into mystery. The divers prepared for a second dive at dawn. The sea was calm, the horizon washed in pale light, but below the surface was another world entirely, a place where time seemed to slow and the past pressed down with every foot of descent. Marcus Kellen led the way, his flashlight beam slicing into the blackness as the team dropped steadily into the cold. At 200 feet, the water thickened with silt, stirred up by their own movements. Visibility dropped to only a few feet, the divers reduced to silhouettes gliding through a heavy darkness. Their instruments worked, but the ocean floor felt wrong. The contours didn't match their charts. It was as though the seabed itself had shifted, molded into unnatural ridges. One diver later said it felt like swimming through the hollow of something immense, as if the sea had carved out space around whatever lay below. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became. Even the usual chatter on comms grew hushed, the men instinctively lowering their voices as though afraid of waking something. When they reached 230 feet, the beam of Marcus's light caught on steel. Rusted, jagged edges protruded from the sand like bones. The divers fanned out, sweeping their lights, and the shape revealed itself in fragments, the remains of a naval vessel, broken but unmistakable. The wreckage was half swallowed by the seafloor, time and tide having pulled it into partial burial. As they hovered above it, one diver muttered the thought they were all thinking. It's not on any record. This wasn't supposed to be here, and if it was the cyclone, or part of it, then someone had lied about what really happened in 1968. The divers moved closer, their gloved hands brushing away layers of silt. They traced the skeletal remains of bulkheads, the warped outlines of compartments. And then, tucked beneath a collapsed section of metal, they saw it again. A rectangular shape that didn't belong to the ship's structure. They cleared the sand with deliberate sweeps, the water clouding and then settling until the outline became undeniable. A locker. It was sealed tight, the latch fused with corrosion, but its shape had held against 50 years of pressure. One of the divers pulled out a tool and scraped away at the surface. Beneath the grime, faint scratches appeared. Letters. At first they seemed random, but when the light caught just right, the marking was clear. R.H. Robert Hale. The initials looked as though they had been carved by hand, not stamped by machine. The divers froze, exchanging glances through their masks. Marcus steadied his breathing, heart pounding in his ears. It was impossible. Hale had vanished without a trace, his belongings supposedly recovered, his journals stored in naval archives. So why was his locker here, buried with a ship that wasn't supposed to exist? They signaled to ascend, leaving the locker undisturbed for recovery teams. But as they began their slow rise, one diver swore he heard something through his comms. Not static, not his teammates, but a whisper. A single word stretched thin by water and time: leave. The recovery took weeks of planning. Naval authorities were alerted quietly, historians looped in only on a need-to-know basis. Marcus Kellen and his team were ordered to stand down as government divers took over the operation. When the locker was finally brought to the surface, streaked with rust and dripping with 50 years of salt water, a hush fell across the deck. No one spoke as technicians cut away the fused latch and pried the door open. The smell hit first, not rot, but the stale, metallic tang of air trapped for decades. Inside was something no one expected to find intact: skeletal remains, folded into the confined space as if whoever was inside had been deliberately sealed away. The bones were bleached but surprisingly well preserved, protected from decay by the airtight compartment. A jawbone lay tilted upward, as though the skull had once rested against the metal wall. Fragments of fabric clung to the ribcage, the remnants of a naval uniform. Silence hung over the deck as forensic specialists began their work, carefully removing the remains and cataloging every detail. Weeks later, after DNA samples were tested against preserved records from the Hale family, the results came back. Positive match: Robert Hale. The young sailor who had vanished without a splash in 1968, whose name had lived in whispers and legends, was no longer just a ghost story. He had been found. But the discovery only deepened the mystery. If Hale's body had been locked inside a compartment on a vessel fragment, how had it gotten there? Who had sealed him in? The Navy called it a tragic accident, speculating he had hidden during a storm or been trapped in a flooding compartment. But those who examined the locker saw no signs of flooding, no dents, no indication of an accident. Just a man placed there, sealed in, and left to vanish from history. The bones weren't the only thing inside the locker. Scattered around Robert Hale's remains were artifacts that spoke of his final moments, objects that turned evidence into something far more personal. The first was a journal, water-damaged but still legible, the ink smudged in places, but words intact enough to read. The entries stopped abruptly on June 12th, the day he disappeared. The last page bore a chilling line: "They are here." Next to it was the compass his father had given him, the one Margaret had once seen him polish absent-mindedly during shore leave. The needle was frozen, unmoving, pointing not north, but locked at a random angle, as if magnetized by something unseen. Then there was the watch, corroded, its glass face cracked, but the hands still visible. They were frozen at precisely 10:15 a.m., the moment Robert had been reported missing. Investigators debated endlessly. Had the watch simply broken when the locker sealed? Or was it marking the exact second his life ended? Margaret Hale, now elderly, wept when the items were returned to her. She ran her fingers across the journal, unwilling to turn past the final page. To her, they weren't artifacts. They were pieces of a man, stolen from her decades earlier, proof that he had been alive long enough to leave behind a final message. For the divers, for the historians, for anyone who had heard the legend of Robert Hale, the artifacts raised more questions than they answered. The Navy insisted on a narrative of tragedy and entrapment. But the frozen compass, the broken watch, the cryptic journal, they suggested something else, something deliberate, something waiting in the dark beneath the waves. When archivists began carefully drying and restoring Robert Hale's journal, the entries revealed a chilling descent into fear. The first pages were neat, measured, ordinary notes about ship routines, brief reflections on his wife Margaret, and sketches of the horizon he had grown up loving. But as the weeks of 1968 wore on, his handwriting grew ragged, letters pressed so hard into the paper that they nearly tore through. The entries in the final days were nothing short of frantic. "The figures are closer now," one line read. "They rise with the tide. I hear them when the engine's quiet." On another page, "There is a shadow under the ship. I see it when the fog comes. No one else believes me. The last complete entry, dated the very night before his disappearance, contained only a single sentence. If they take me tomorrow, tell her I knew. The following page was smeared, as if written in haste, the ink running where the water damage had bled through. But words could still be made out. In the water, watching, waiting. Then, scrawled near the bottom, barely legible, a hand on the rail. Investigators debated whether those were literal descriptions or the fevered imaginings of a mind pushed past exhaustion. But to anyone who had studied the Hale case, the words aligned too closely with the whispers his crewmates remembered, the pacing at night, the arguments about shadows, the sense that he was being watched. It was no longer just legend. Hale himself had left testimony in his final words. And whatever he saw in those last days, he had believed it enough to carve it into paper, desperate for someone to understand. The recovery of Robert Hale's journal reignited debates that had smoldered for decades. Naval psychologists argued the simplest explanation: hallucinations brought on by fatigue, isolation, and the claustrophobic life aboard a patrol ship. To them, Hale's frantic entries reflected a mind unraveling, a young sailor buckling under pressure. But not everyone agreed. Oceanographers pointed to anomalies in the region where Hale vanished, unexplained sonar echoes, compasses drifting off true north, reports from fishermen about sudden currents that seemed to pull against the tide. Others noted the eerie coincidence of the 1993 anniversary storm, when multiple crews swore they saw a lone figure on the waves. Skeptics dismissed those stories as superstition. Believers insisted they matched exactly what Hale had described in his journal. Fringe theorists went further, claiming Hale had encountered something the Navy knew about but buried, citing the redactions in his official file and the mysterious map with the marked X. Some even whispered of Cold War experiments, that the Cyclone had been testing classified sonar systems, and Hale had witnessed or been affected by something he was never meant to see. Margaret Hale, now frail but lucid, refused to speculate. To her, the journal was not proof of hallucination or conspiracy. It was her husband's voice across 50 years of silence, a glimpse into the fear he carried before he vanished. Yet for the divers who had brought up his locker, for the historians piecing together fragments of testimony, the journal was more than grief on paper. It was evidence that Robert Hale had seen something real, whether natural, unnatural, or unimaginable, in those final hours. And with that, the debate over what had claimed him began anew. When the DNA results confirmed the skeletal remains as Robert Hale, the Navy arranged a formal transfer of his body to the surviving Hale family. Margaret had passed away just a few years earlier, but nieces, nephews, and grandchildren who had grown up only with the story of his disappearance gathered for the ceremony. They had heard whispers their whole lives about the sailor who vanished, the lantern his widow lit every June, the unanswered questions that had hung over their family like a cloud. Now, after 50 years, they stood face to face with the truth. Robert was no longer a legend, but flesh and bone returned from the abyss. The casket was draped in the American flag, carried slowly past a line of sailors in dress uniform. For the family, it was a moment both devastating and healing. The sorrow came first, sharp and heavy. They were burying a man they had never truly known, a ghost whose absence had shaped their lives. Yet, peace came with it. Finally, the waiting was over. The endless nights of wondering, the stories that kept the grief alive, could be laid to rest. Margaret had died believing her husband was lost forever, but her descendants could now honor her faith. She had never remarried, never stopped lighting the lantern, never stopped believing that Robert was out there. In a way, she had kept him alive long enough to be found. As the bugler's notes drifted across the cemetery, Evelyn Hale's words from decades earlier returned in whispers. He didn't just fall. Something took him. The truth of what that meant remained unsolved, but at least Robert Hale was home. The family made one final decision. Robert would not rest in an anonymous military cemetery. He would be buried beside Margaret, the woman who had waited half a century with a lantern in her window. When the casket was lowered, the headstone above hers was unveiled. Robert Hale, 1944 to 1968. Lost but returned. Neighbors from the coastal town attended, many remembering Margaret's solitary vigils at the shoreline. For years they had watched her walk to the beach on the night of June 12th, lantern in hand, standing against the dark water until her legs trembled. Some had thought it was madness, others had thought it was devotion. Now it was vindication. Her ritual had not been in vain. She had kept his memory alive long enough for him to come home. At the graveside, one of Robert's granddaughters placed Margaret's old lantern on the earth between their stones. She lit it, its flame flickering against the afternoon wind, a final symbol of the vigil that had spanned 2 generations. Family members wept quietly, but there was relief in their tears. The lantern that had once been a beacon of longing was now a beacon of closure. Robert and Margaret were reunited side by side, their story no longer unfinished. Yet even as the earth closed over them, the mystery of what had taken Robert remained. The ocean had finally returned his body, but it had kept the truth. And for those who believed in legends, the lantern's flame was not just a farewell, it was a warning, a reminder that the sea takes, and sometimes it gives back, but never without cost. For decades, the Navy had insisted Robert Hale's death was an accident, a man overboard, lost to the sea. But the discovery of his remains in a sealed locker, along with his journal and artifacts, forced officials to reconsider. In 2019, the file was quietly reopened. The language in the new report was cautious, almost reluctant, but it marked a significant shift, casualty of unexplained maritime circumstances. It was the closest the Navy had ever come to admitting they didn't know what had truly happened. At a small ceremony on the San Diego base where Robert had once been stationed, a new plaque was unveiled. His name was carved clean into bronze, no longer just one among countless sailors lost at sea, but now listed under a new section created for those whose deaths could not be explained. Sailors in dress whites stood at attention, saluting as the family laid wreaths. For his descendants, the moment was bittersweet. Recognition had come, but it was 50 years too late for Margaret or Evelyn to see. Navy officials offered brief statements, framing the case as a reminder of the dangers of the sea. Yet even in their careful words there was an undercurrent of unease. Some avoided reporters' questions about the journal, about the compass, about why Hale's body had been found inside a compartment no one could explain. The file had been reopened, yes, but much of it was sealed again almost immediately. Still, for the family and for sailors who had whispered Hale's name in bunkrooms and bars, the plaque was a kind of justice. His death was no longer dismissed as carelessness. The Navy had admitted, however subtly, that something about Robert's disappearance did not fit into their tidy records. And in that gap, that acknowledgement of mystery, the legend of Robert Hale grew stronger than ever. Even after his body was laid to rest, Robert Hale's story refused to end. Along the California coast, fishermen began to tell new stories, blending truth with myth as easily as waves blend with tide. Some swore that on fog-heavy nights, a lone figure in whites could be seen standing near the breakers, lantern light flickering faintly beside him. Others claimed that when storms rose suddenly in the waters where Hale had vanished, their compasses spun wildly until a current seemed to pull them back toward safety. They called it Hale's Drift, a mysterious tide that appeared in moments of peril, carrying boats away from danger. Younger sailors, hearing the tales for the first time, spoke of him as both a warning and a protector, a man taken by the ocean who now guided others away from its grasp. Locals embraced the folklore. At coastal taverns, his story was told beside that of shipwrecks and phantom lights. Tourists whispered of visiting Margaret's grave at dusk and seeing her lantern glow brighter than its flame should allow, as if answering something out at sea. Scholars dismissed it as superstition, the natural human need to make sense of loss by weaving it into myth. But to those who had felt the phantom current or glimpsed a figure in the fog, the stories carried weight. Robert Hale had become more than a missing sailor returned after 50 years. He had become part of the sea itself, a name spoken in reverence by those who lived and worked on the water. The ocean had claimed him, yes, but in death it seemed he had claimed a piece of it in return. And so the legends grew, drifting from ship to shore, until Hale was no longer just a sailor who vanished, but a guardian whose spirit still moved with the tides. In the years following the discovery of Robert Hale's remains, divers returned to the wreck site more than once. Technology improved, equipment became safer, and curiosity gnawed at the edges of restraint. For if one locker had held the truth of Hale's disappearance, what else might lie sealed within the fragments of steel scattered across the seabed? The sonar scans showed multiple compartments still buried in silt, their outlines distinct and unmistakable. Some appeared large enough to hold more than a single man. Yet when the divers hovered above them, preparing to cut through the encrusted metal, hesitation always set in. The memory of what had already been found, a body preserved as if the ocean itself had conspired to hide it, weighed heavily on every diver who descended. Marcus Kellen, the man who had first spotted the initials RH, returned once more in 2021. He stared at the compartments through the murk of his visor, his breath shallow, his light trembling across corroded steel. He later admitted that he couldn't bring himself to touch them. "It felt like opening a door you weren't meant to," he said, "like whatever was inside wanted to stay there." The compartments remained sealed, untouched, sitting in silence at the bottom of the Pacific. Some say they hold nothing but rust and seawater. Others whisper of more names, more men sealed away by a story the Navy never told. For now, the ocean keeps its echo, daring the living to reach deeper while reminding them that some truths might be better left undisturbed. Robert Hale's story ended with a grave beside his wife, a lantern finally extinguished, and a family granted the bittersweet gift of closure. Yet, in another sense, it never truly ended. His disappearance, his frantic journal, the strange artifacts recovered with him, none of it offered a neat conclusion. The sea had given back his body, but not his truth. And so the questions linger, drifting like the tides. Was Robert simply a sailor who lost his grip in the fog? Was he a man broken by isolation, his final words no more than the scribblings of exhaustion? Or was he, as the whispers insisted, claimed by something deeper, a shadow beneath the waves, a presence that waited in silence and took what it was owed? The Navy called him a casualty of unexplained maritime circumstances. Sailors call him a warning. Locals call him a ghost. His family called him a husband, a son, a man stolen too soon. Perhaps all of them are right. What remains certain is that the ocean keeps its secrets. It erases with storms, buries with currents, and silences with pressure, until all that is left are fragments, bones, journals, frozen watches, stories carried on salt air. Robert Hale's name has been returned to the world, but the why of his fate remains beneath the waves, still waiting. And maybe that is the truest lesson the sea ever teaches. Not every mystery is meant to be solved. Some are meant to endure, echoing forever in the dark. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.